as we come to the close of chapter 24, we find out in verse 27, when 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. So in other words, there was a change of political administration. There was a change of leadership in Caesarea. Felix is out, Festus is in. So now this is where we pick up because of the situation that Festus has the situation that was left to him, and that was, again, at the end of 24, Felix wanted to grant the Jews a favor, so he left Paul in prison. He didn't come to a final conclusion. He didn't exonerate Paul, or he didn't turn Paul over to the Jews in order for them to exact what would have been his death, because they were seeking not to find justice; they were seeking to kill him. I remember, I think it was back in 23 or 21 when Paul was arrested. There were people shouting that that this man deserves to die. He does not even deserve to live. So there is definitely a strong sense of hatred and animosity and bitterness from the Jewish leadership towards Paul. So this is where we find ourselves. Luke, we find here that Porcius Festus comes in. Luke doesn't provide us with any explanation, any background. What happened to Felix? Was there a circumstance or a situation? You would have to go to some extra biblical research, maybe some first century historians. Someone like Josephus could probably give some information as to what was going on, but Luke just doesn't deal with that. He just lets us know that Felix is out, Festus is in. And that's what we pick up in chapter 25, and that's what we want to look at tonight. We want to talk about probably the first 10 days to 2 weeks of the new administration, Festus administration. He's the procurator now. He's responsible for what goes on in Jerusalem, in the Caesarea and that surrounding area. They are under his watch care. So this is what we're going to look at. And we're going to just begin to work our way down through verses 1 through 5, because that's what we find out a little bit about how things transpire immediately when Festus comes to power. Notice what it says. 3 days after arriving in the province, now the province would be in the area, and he's arriving to Caesarea. He's coming to his new post. Festus is. When he arrives in the province, the first thing he does is he leaves Caesarea, travels 60 to 65 miles to Jerusalem. And he goes there primarily because Jerusalem is where things really happen. Jerusalem is the religious and cultural center of the people that he is responsible for. His jurisdiction, that's where things are happening. That's where the temple is happening. That's where the Jews are. And the biggest problem that Felix had and Festus would have would be keeping the peace with the Jewish people in relationship to them being held under Roman occupation. Because they're in their land, the Romans are occupying, and there's always this tension. So his responsibility is to keep the peace, the Pax Romana, keeping the peace of Rome in there. So he goes there in order to become, I'm sure, more familiar with the situation, the circumstance, everything that's going on, and to make himself known. I remember one time years ago, I was working for a corporation, and there was a change at the very top. We had a new chief executive officer come in, and he had this huge, what was just beginning to be popular at that time, because this is probably 25 years ago or something like that, and this huge teleconference where the manager of every branch and those who had been invited to be a part of this huge teleconference was to gather, and everybody's checking in, and they're going down this roll call. There's probably 80, 90 names, people out here. And then he comes on, and he says, "My name is this. I just want you to know one thing. There's a new sheriff in town." And, I mean, he was just letting us know that things up to that point were what they were, but from this point on, things were going to be different. Kind of set the tone. Well, Festus going to Jerusalem, part of that would have been to have let the chief priest and the religious leadership let them know that there's a new sheriff in town, and he is it. And that's kind of what we see here. Look at verse 2. So he goes from, in verse 1, he goes from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Now look at verse 2. Where the chief priest and the Jewish leaders appeared before him. So they were aware of who he was. They knew Felix was out. They knew Festus was coming in. And they appeared before him. But they appeared before him for a purpose. And so what happens here is we notice that the Jewish leadership, they waste no time in their relentless attempt to do away with Paul, to kill Paul. Where is Paul? Paul's in Caesarea, but the one who can help them get their hands on Paul happens to be in their city, in Jerusalem. And so they waste no time. Isn't that what verse 2 says? Where the chief priests and Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented charges against Paul. And then verse 3, they said they urgently requested. So they're pleading urgently before Festus, if you could just let us have Paul. So can you imagine? You're 3 days into the job. You go to the cultural, religious center of your jurisdiction, and the first thing you get hit with is not, hey, how are you? Tell us about your family. Tell us about your past experience. It's about a man by the name of Paul. Who's not, he's a Roman citizen, but as far as anybody else would know him, they would have recognized him more as a prominent Jew. This is what they want to talk to him about. It's not about the temple. It's not about temple regulations, holy days. It's not about, hey, when the annual pilgrim festivals come and the city explodes with population, people coming from everywhere here to worship at the temple. We don't hear any of that. They're relentless. And they're urgently requesting Festus to do a favor for them. Do us a favor. And what do they want done? Again in verse 3. They want Paul to be transferred from Caesarea to Jerusalem. And not because they want to finally put the issue to rest in a legitimate, legal way, which the Romans were very particular in their legal in their legal practices, but not more than the Jews were supposed to be. There's a whole book in the Bible written about how we are to treat one another from God's perspective. So, this is what they're wanting. Festus, do us a favor. Transfer Paul from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Now, after the comma there in verse 3, we find out why. Because they're looking to ambush him and kill him on the way. So that's what it says there. Verse 4, Festus answered, Paul is held at Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. And we'll read here in just a few minutes, after 8 or 10 more days, Festus takes his entourage, his probably high-ranking officials with him, would have traveled with him. He takes them and they go back to Caesarea. But at this point, he says to them, I'm going back home here in a few days. Let some of your leaders come with me and press charges against the man there. Now notice what it says. If he's done anything wrong. Luke doesn't give us any idea as to how much someone from Felix, from his administration, may have informed him about a prisoner that was left over. But so we don't really know all that he knows about Paul. But he says here, if he's done anything wrong, let them come and charge him there. But the interesting thing, and I think something for us to look at tonight, the chief priests and the leaders, they're the ones that are responsible for handling, teaching, training the children, the people of Israel in relation to the law of God. How they are to live, how they are to live in relationship to God, how they are to live in relationship to their neighbor. The responsibility is upon them. They're the recognized authorities, and they're also supposed to be the public examples of how you go about treating your neighbor. That being said, what does their plot against Paul say about their integrity? Let's think back. There was 40 men, anonymous men, we don't really know who they are, probably some of them were part of the Sanhedrin. 40 men who said, we've taken a vow, told the leadership of the Sanhedrin, we've taken a vow, we're not going to eat again, we're going on a hunger strike until Paul is dead. But now, Luke says something. He lets us know that it's the Jewish leadership who is responsible for the ambush or the plot against Paul. So what does it say about those who have been saddled with the responsibility to lead by example, to teach the truth of God's Word? What does it say about their integrity? Not good, right? Not good. Apparently their emotions has overcome their sense of right and wrong. There is such animosity, such bitterness. They see Paul as such a threat, as a big threat to them, and they would relate that to the national security, which we hear statements like that all the time. Everything is a national security threat now. Threat to the temple. They said he's a threat to the temple. They said he's a threat to Jews everywhere in the whole world. That's what they've already accused Paul of before Felix. So he doesn't say much about their leadership. And what happens? The leadership of any organization, any group of people, any country, any nation, at some point in time, the outward actions, the testimony of the leadership is going to impact the lifestyle of those who are under their jurisdiction. It's just going to, at some point, begin to influence people to follow the leader as opposed to following the truth. That's why it's so important that we be able to hold leaders accountable. Accountable to what? Our wants and desires? No, accountable to the truth. Accountable to the truth of God's Word. Especially in the body of Christ. We're talking about the children of God here. Well, if we think about the church, especially in the church, that those in leadership, that we be able to hold their testimony and their example up to the teaching of God's Word. And that they be people of integrity. What does Paul talk about in his letter to Timothy? If you're seeking leaders, you're seeking elders, or if you're seeking deacons, these are people who are going to be leaders within the body of Christ. If you're seeking to find men, then there needs to be a certain type of character. He mentions about 8 or 9 specific things that should help identify a person of what? Integrity. Someone that the people can see as a good example, someone that they can follow after. Paul can easily say, and says on more than one occasion, especially in 1 Corinthians 11, that imitate me as I imitate Christ. So I think we can infer from that, if he's not imitating Christ, should we imitate him? No. But as long as he is following after Christ, walking in his steps, then he is an example of a person of integrity that we can follow after. And that's why Paul talks so much about personal testimony. And on Sunday mornings, we started in the book of Colossians, and it's all about, the transformation in our life as new believers, building that testimony. We're in Thessalonians now, and it's the same thing. It's like, he could have just changed the title on his letter, but he couldn't have, because the letter to Colossians had specific things about what the people there were facing. In Thessalonica was a little bit different, but still, the fact that we are to live lives worthy, we are to be people of integrity, never changes. Whether you live here in Louisville or whether you live in Lexington, our walk our testimony as a believer should never change. So it does not put the leadership in a very good position or in a very good light because of what they are willing to do, and they're trying to work politically now. They're trying to get their foot in the door. As soon as Festus, his administration comes on the scene, they're trying to quickly gain a favor from him. And that favor is to be complicit by handing Paul over to them so that they can take his life. So, what do we see next in verse 6 and down to 6 through verses 11 and 12? When Festus returns to Caesarea, he provides the Jews an opportunity to bring charges against Paul. Look at verse 6. After spending 8 or 10 days with him, he went down to Caesarea. And notice how quickly he provides the opportunity. He's not delaying. He's not stalling. He said, have some of your guys come down to Caesarea, and then we'll see if there's anything that Paul has done wrong, we'll address it. So he says here, the next day, he convened the court, and when the court was convened, Festus ordered that Paul be brought before him. In verse 7, the Jews, they begin to come back with their same list of charges. They bring serious charges against him. And I think it's Dr. Polhill in his commentary on the book of Acts talks about, he thinks that, or he begins to intimate here that he believes Luke is sharing something more than just a list of charges by what he says. Notice in verse 7, let's read it together, what happens. When Paul appeared, look at the next phrase. The Jews who had come down from Jerusalem, they stood around him. And he believes that what's happening here is it's a ploy of intimidation. There's a group of them, and they stand around him, and they begin to make serious charges. Isn't that what it says? They bring many serious charges against him. To a new man, this is Festus. He's the new guy on the job. So they bring these serious charges. The only problem is it's the same issue that they had in the trial before Felix, although Felix would not render a decision. It's the same problem. They don't have any evidence. This is all hearsay. Paul, before Felix, said, if these accusations were true, there should be some people from these areas in Asia Minor here to testify. And Paul is saying they have none, so therefore he's implying that the charges are trumped up. They're false. And the same thing is happening here. They can't prove or they can't support their claims, although all they can do is make their accusations. Now, it's the Jews that have the long-standing tradition that it takes witnesses to back up your accusation. It takes at least how many witnesses?
3 or 2.
2 to 3. 2 or 3 witnesses to affirm your statement. And here the Jews are. They've traveled 65 miles bringing their case, but they forgot to bring anyone to back up their charges. There are none. There is no one. And Paul knows that. So, what do we see happening here in verses 8 and following? The beautiful thing here is that Paul happens to be a Roman citizen, and Festus would know this. Festus, as a member of the Roman government, who also doesn't want, I'm sure, anything negative going from the center of, going from the area that he is responsible for. He doesn't want any negative commentary going back to Rome, to the home office, so to speak. He doesn't want that. He's responsible to a certain extent for Paul because Paul is a Roman citizen. So Paul made his defense. Look at verse 8, Paul's defense. He said, I've done nothing wrong against the law of the Jews. That was the accusation that was presented to us back in the earlier chapters, where everywhere he went, he was stirring up the Jews. He said he's not broken any law against them or against the temple. The accusation that was brought against him was that he had brought a Gentile into the temple area. He said that's not true. Or have I broken any laws against Caesar? He's not an insurrectionist. He's not promoting sedition. And remember, we talked about how before Felix, it seemed as though Tertullus was trying to pin this on Paul, and by pinning these charges on Paul, he could, by association, make the same charge against all who were followers of the way, or Christians. And Paul says none of this is true. And it can't be proven against him. Now Festus, notice what happens here. Festus, it seems that Festus may be willing to send Paul to Jerusalem. Festus wanting to do the Jews a favor. And you can probably understand that. If you're a Gentile, and you know just by your presence there, they don't want you there, how can I keep some type of conciliatory relationship with the people? You try to do favors now. He wants to do a favor to the Jews, and he says, are you willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges? I'm sure Paul knows if I ever end up in Jerusalem, I will somehow end up dead. Because we know already of 2 plots against his life. And Paul answered, I am now standing before Caesar's court. Paul is a Roman citizen by birth. And he says, this is where I ought to be tried. I've done nothing wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well in verse 10. If, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving of charges brought against me by these Jews, which are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. And then this is when he makes a statement. This was something he makes an appeal to Caesar. I appeal to Caesar. This was something that was a right given to the Roman citizen. That if a procurator made a decision that they felt like was unfair or didn't accept, they had a right to appeal to Caesar. Now in verse 12, Festus confers with his council, which would have been made up by some of the high-ranking officials in his administration. He talks to them for a minute, and he says, you have appealed to Caesar you shall go. So this is going to be the springboard that leads Paul on towards Rome. But let me say this. In light of what Jesus said to Paul in chapter 23, verse 11, look at it again. This is the interesting thing I think, for me, hopefully it is for you. In chapter 23, verse 11, after Paul had been in the fiasco at the Sanhedrin, where the Lysissius, the Roman commander, had to rescue him once more because the dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces. This is among those men of integrity, that they're going to tear him to pieces. The Lord stood near Paul and said, take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome. So in light of that statement, what would you say that this episode teaches us about the Lord's ability to fulfill his plans? The interesting thing is that the Lord himself told Paul, you're going to Rome. Here the Jewish people, the Jewish nation has come against him once again. But he's using those who are holding his people captive to protect one of the more prominent people that the Lord will use to preach the gospel throughout most of the known world at that time. And just to add something to that, God is going to have the Romans pay his way. So sometimes, at the bottom of the sea, the ground is dry, only when the Lord is at work, leading his people to where he intends for them to go. Because not even Pharaoh's army could thwart God's plan. Nor can a handful of Jewish people who came down to intimidate Paul by standing around him, throwing false accusations to the new man on the job, who himself, or Luke says, would love to give them a favor, would love to do something to put himself or to ingratiate himself to them. Love to give them something. But Paul exercises his right, which who is responsible for a civil government anyway? Isn't it the Lord? According to Romans 13, God is the one responsible for that. So he uses the law of the occupier to protect Paul and see that he is taken, or ultimately going to be taken, to Rome. Hey, the next few verses, we have a few minutes left. Let's look at them very quickly. To Caesar you will go. So Festus, he passes the buck just like Felix did. He doesn't really make a decision, doesn't render a decision. What's he do? He passes the buck. So let's let Caesar address it. But there's a problem. If he's going to sin, if there is a situation, think about this. Festus is the procurator, or he's been placed as the head administrator in this region by Caesar. If there's an issue that he can't handle, and he's going to send the problem to Caesar, what's Caesar going to think about him? Maybe I hired the wrong guy. And that's the last thing that Festus would want. He's what? He's only 2 weeks into the job. So, fortune comes his way. A few days later, his brother-in-law stops by. And his brother-in-law's name is King Agrippa. Since it's his brother-in-law, Bernice is who? Bernice would be Festus' sister. And they come by to pay their respects. I would assume it's congratulatory stuff, right? Hey, I see you've been promoted. Because he came from a smaller region, smaller district where he was in charge. Festus did. To this larger, more prominent region. Since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. He said, hey, when I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him, and they asked to have him condemned. They wanted him killed. And he goes on to say, I told them that it's not the Roman custom to hand a man over before he is faced his accusers and has an opportunity to defend himself against their charges. That's not exactly what he said. But he is he's putting himself in good light here as he's talking to his brother-in-law. Remember, he was wanting to do him a favor if he could. In verse 17, when they came here with me, I did not delay, which is true. The next day he convened the court, and he ordered the man to be brought in. When his accusers got up to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes I had expected. So it sounds like Festus was somewhat surprised by their charges. And then he goes on to explain a little here in verse 19. He says, instead, they had some points of dispute with this man, with Paul, about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus, who Paul claimed was alive. I was at loss how to investigate such matters, so I asked if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on these charges. When Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar. And then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear this man myself. Festus replied, tomorrow you will hear him. If you go back to, we think about who Festus is, who Agrippa is. The Lord has so many ways to strengthen and encourage His people. When we just hear the story as it's unfolding. Have you ever heard someone say, hindsight is 20/20? Or perhaps you've said that. Looking back, I see clearly now. Following the Lord's appearance to Paul in 23:11, when Paul was told by Festus that he was going to get to speak to a king, I just wonder if he remembered what Ananias said in chapter 9, verse 15. Because this is exactly what Ananias told Paul when he was still blind from the Damascus Road experience. He said, Saul, you are the Lord's chosen instrument. and you are going to carry the name of Christ to the Gentiles and to their kings. And where is it? Tomorrow, he gets an opportunity to tell his story to a king. And that's what 26, 23, or 25, 23, all the way through chapter 26. That's what we will read about next week and look at it there. So it just seems like a chronological narration of Paul's life, but there's a lot going on, and I think there's a lot of things that we can take from this if we just allow our imagination to think about it for a moment. One would be, has this ever happened to you? Has something happened? Perhaps at some point in your life, someone had shared what they believed that the Lord was going to do in you, through you, with you, about you. And somewhere down the road, what that person had shared with you comes to fruition, and you think, wow, I remember when this brother or that sister said, I think the Lord's going to do this in your life. And you remember looking back how true that was and how God has been working in your life up to that point. Think about it.